23:57 hours. New Year's Eve, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The new year was 3 minutes away, and Private First Class Daniel Mercer was trying not to freeze to death. In the Ardennes Forest, the ground doesn't just freeze, it turns into armor. When Private First Class Daniel Mercer's shovel hits the earth, it doesn't thud, it rings. A high metallic sound that echoes through the skeletal trees. He's crouched in a foxhole barely deep enough to cover his shoulders, the sides glazed with ice, his gloves stiff with sweat that froze solid hours ago. Every breath he takes burns his lungs like he's inhaling broken glass. Above him, the forest is a black, suffocating silence. Thousands of trees creaking in the wind, their branches snapping under the weight of the snow. Somewhere out there, the Germans are waiting. They're close, too close. Mercer checks his watch. 11:57. Around him, the men of his squad haven't spoken in hours. In this kind of cold, speech is a wasted effort, a luxury they can't afford. Even the veterans, the men who survived the bloodbaths of Normandy and the hedgerows, are dead quiet now. This isn't a New Year's celebration. This is a countdown. The German artillery stopped firing 20 minutes ago, and that silence is more terrifying than the shells ever were. In the Ardennes, silence means only one thing. Something massive is being lined up in the dark. Across the frozen ridge, the American line is thin, fragile, and manned by exhausted units that were sent here to rest. Instead, they've been thrown into the largest German counteroffensive of the entire war. The Germans call it Wacht am Rhein. The world will call it the Battle of the Bulge. But Mercer doesn't care about the names. He only knows the math. His squad is outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of everything. Food, ammo, and time. And tonight, the Germans are coming to finish the job. Without warning, a flare bursts overhead. It turns the world a stark, blinding white for a single, frozen second. You see the trees, the holes, and the terrified faces of men clutching rifles with numb white fingers. Mercer's heart slams into his ribs. His finger tightens on the trigger of his M1 Garand. Then the light dies. Darkness returns, followed by nothing but the soft hiss of falling snow. Sergeant Halverson's voice cuts through the cold like a knife. Don't shoot unless you see the whites of their eyes. Mercer's mouth is dry, tasting of bitter cordite and metallic fear. He thinks of home, of Ohio, where his parents are sitting by a warm radio, and his mother is making black-eyed peas for luck. He checks his watch again. 11:59. The wind picks up, pushing a low fog through the trees until visibility vanishes into a gray nothingness. Then the ground begins to vibrate. It's a deep, throaty rumble that shakes the ice in Mercer's foxhole. Engines, Maybach engines. Panthers and Tigers. Heavy armor that can roll through a foxhole as if it weren't there. Mercer's squad has nothing to stop them but a single bazooka with 2 rockets and a handful of grenades. The radio crackles with a voice that's clipped and hollow. Be advised. Increased enemy movement. Stand by. Stand by for what? Mercer stares into the fog, his eyes burning from exhaustion. He hasn't slept in days. The watch ticks. Midnight arrives with no cheers and no fireworks. It arrives with the roar of German artillery that rips the night apart. Trees explode into splinters. Snow geysers 50 feet into the air. The ground shakes like an earthquake. Someone screams, "Incoming!" as Mercer flattens himself against the frozen dirt. Shrapnel whines overhead, and the air fills with the choking smell of high explosives. This is preparation fire. Deliberate, measured, and terrifyingly precise. One shell obliterates the machine gun nest to the right, and the gun goes silent instantly. Then through the thunder, he hears it. Voices. Shouting, the crunch of boots. The German infantry is advancing under the cover of the barrage. Halverson fires a red flare, and the forest turns a hellish crimson. Dark shapes are everywhere, moving between the trees, helmets low, rifles ready. They are closer than Mercer ever imagined. Open fire! The ridge erupts. M1 rifles crack and machine guns chatter, tracers slicing through the fog in angry red lines. Mercer fires until his shoulder is numb, ejecting clip after clip, barely seeing what he's aiming at. A German soldier stumbles into view 10 yards away, his face pale with the same animal terror Mercer feels, and Mercer fires. The man drops without a sound. There is no time to think. Grenades detonate in the trees, and a high animal scream cuts off abruptly. Then the tanks arrive. The fog parts just enough for Mercer to see the silhouette of a panther looming through the trees, its turret already rotating. The barrel points directly at his position. The bazooka team fumbles in the slush, their fingers too frozen to move. The Panther fires. The blast is deafening, throwing Mercer backward against the frozen dirt. His vision blurs and snow rains down like ash. When he forces himself up, the world is tilted and distant. His ears are ringing so loudly he can't hear himself breathe. The bazooka team is gone. The Panther is still coming. Halverson grabs Mercer by the collar, dragging him back into the hole, screaming, "Hold the line!" Mercer checks his watch one last time. 12:14 a.m. 14 minutes into the new year, and the Germans are still coming. Somewhere behind the lines, officers are realizing the truth. This wasn't a probing attack. This was a full-scale push meant to break them before dawn. The year had changed. The war had not. And before the sun rose, the snow of Belgium would become one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in American history. The Panther did not stop. It advanced at a walking pace, iron tracks grinding through frozen underbrush, crushing saplings and foxholes with a cold, mechanical indifference. Its engine note was low and steady, not strained, not hurried. It sounded confident. To Mercer, crouched in the freezing mud, it sounded bored. The fog clung to its sloped armor like smoke against a furnace. Every few seconds, the turret twitched, correcting its aim, hunting for movement. The gun barrel followed the ridgeline the way a finger traces words on a page. Halverson shoved Mercer's helmet down hard, hissing, "Stay low! Don't let that thing see you move!" Mercer pressed his face into the ice, his heart slamming so hard it felt like it might punch through his ribs. He could smell gasoline, cordite, and a sour, coppery scent that meant blood was close. Too close. The Panther fired again. This time the shell landed short, detonating in the shallow ravine just below the ridge. The concussion rolled over Mercer like a physical wave. His foxhole collapsed inward, dirt and ice slamming against his ribs, pinning him. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The pressure crushed the air out of his lungs until bright sparks exploded behind his eyes. He clawed upward, gasping, dragging himself free just as German machine gun fire stitched across the ridge. Tracers snapped inches overhead, carving glowing lines through the fog. Someone screamed, a long, agonizing sound that cut off with a wet finality. The Germans were no longer advancing cautiously. They were running. Mercer saw them now. Infantry pouring out from the trees in squads, boots pounding, rifles at the shoulder. These weren't green troops. These were veterans pulled from quieter sectors and thrown into this push with orders that didn't include retreat. A German soldier vaulted a fallen log and fired from the hip, spraying ice chips like shrapnel. Mercer rolled onto his side and fired back, his Garand bucking violently in the compressed, fog-choked air. The man went down. Another took his place, and another. It felt endless. "Bazooka! Where the hell is my bazooka?" Halverson shouted. No one answered. The bazooka team had been erased in the first blast. There was no second chance. The Panther kept coming, now close enough that Mercer could see individual weld seams on the armor. The tank fired its machine gun, and the ridgeline disappeared in a storm of sparks and dirt. One round punched through Mercer's sleeve, grazing his forearm. The pain was hot and sharp, completely out of place in the sub-zero cold. He didn't look at it. He couldn't. To his left, an American machine gun opened up, then immediately stopped. The barrel had frozen solid. The gunner beat on it with a gloved hand, screaming in frustration until a burst of German fire cut him down mid-motion. Mercer's world shrank. There was no grand strategy now, just survival measured in seconds. Halverson leaned over the foxhole, shouting directly into Mercer's ear, "We're pulling back. When I say move, you move." Mercer scrambled out and ran. His boots slipped on ice-slick ground as he sprinted through shattered trees and drifting smoke. Bullets cracked past him, some so close he felt the air move. He dove behind a fallen tree trunk as another shell flattened him against the ground. Snow poured down from the branches like powdered cement. Around him, the line wasn't bending anymore. It was breaking. An American half-track roared past on the road below, men clinging to the sides until a German shell caught it mid-frame. The vehicle disintegrated in a blossom of fire and steel, throwing bodies like rag dolls. Mercer stared, frozen, until Halverson dragged him forward. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" They stumbled into a shallow draw where 15 survivors were regrouping. Faces were pale, eyes glassy. One man was crying openly, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't reload his rifle. Above them, the ridge burned. The Panther crested it slowly, triumphantly, its gun searching for new targets. Mercer felt something inside him crack. This wasn't just an attack. This was a breakthrough. Farther back, American artillery finally responded, shells screaming overhead and turning trees into clouds of splinters. The German advance slowed, but it didn't stop. Halverson keyed his radio, shouting into static, "This is Fox Company. We are being overrun. Request immediate fire mission danger close." A distant, strained voice answered, "Copy. Stand by." Stand by again. Mercer checked his watch. 0038 hours. 38 minutes into the new year. The temperature kept dropping. Men began to shake uncontrollably, their muscles locking as frostbite set in. The Germans pushed again just before dawn. This time they came with flamethrowers. Mercer saw the fire first, a roaring orange light cutting through the gray like a wound. A jet of flame washed across a foxhole, and the screaming that followed didn't sound human. Men bolted from cover, burning, only to be mown down. The smell hit Mercer seconds later. Burning oil, burning cloth, burning flesh. Halverson fired until his rifle clicked empty, then hurled a grenade blindly into the fog. The Americans were being compressed, pushed into smaller and smaller pockets. Finally, the order came. Fall back to secondary positions. Mercer didn't know where those positions were. He just ran. As dawn bled into the sky, the forest revealed what the night had hidden. Bodies lay everywhere, half buried in snow. Abandoned weapons littered the ground. Mercer reached a new defensive line hours later, his hands shaking so badly he could barely load a clip. Behind him, the Germans held ground that had been American at midnight. Ahead of him, officers were realizing the truth. This was the opening of a gap that could split the Allied front in half. The new year had begun with a retreat, and it was only the first day. The retreat didn't feel like movement. It felt like being peeled off the battlefield one frozen layer at a time. Mercer reached the secondary line just as the sky finished turning from black to a sickly gray blue. Dawn in the Ardennes didn't bring clarity or relief. It only revealed the damage. Men stumbled into position with hollow eyes, uniforms stiff with ice, faces burned raw by wind and cordite. Some collapsed the moment they stopped moving, legs finally refusing to hold their weight. Others stood in place, swaying, gripping rifles they could barely feel. The line they were forming wasn't a line at all. It was a suggestion. A shallow trench scraped out of frozen ground. A few interlocking fields of fire guessed at in the dark. No wire, no mines, no armor support. Just infantry trying to look solid enough to scare an enemy that had already proved it wasn't afraid. Mercer sank into the trench and pressed his back against the frozen wall. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion. He flexed his fingers, willing them to move, forcing blood back into them through pain. Every joint burned. His arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, the sleeve stiff with frozen blood. A medic crawled past, dragging a man whose boots were gone, lost somewhere in the night. The exposed feet were gray, white, and wrong-looking, already beyond saving. The man wasn't screaming. He was quiet. That was worse. Behind the line, officers were shouting into radios that barely worked in the cold. Batteries died in minutes. Antennas iced over. Messages went out fractured and came back distorted. Somewhere, command was trying to understand what had just happened. Somewhere else, the Germans were reorganizing. The shelling started again at 112 hours. This barrage was different. It wasn't wild, it wasn't probing, it was methodical. Shells walked down the line with deliberate spacing, each explosion timed to force men deeper into cover just before the next one arrived. Airbursts snapped tree trunks in half, sending wooden shards spinning like knives. The concussion flattened Mercer against the trench wall again, his teeth rattling, his ears ringing until the world turned distant and underwater. A runner dropped into the trench beside him, breath coming in ragged clouds. "They're pushing armor through the gap," he gasped. "More tanks. Grenadiers with them. They're not stopping." Mercer nodded, though the words barely registered. He peeked over the lip of the trench. The forest ahead was alive with movement. German infantry advanced in loose formation now, spreading out, learned caution replacing the reckless momentum of the night assault. They moved tree to tree, using the terrain, rifles up. Behind them came the darker shapes of half-tracks and armored cars, engines growling low, exhaust pluming in the cold air. This was exploitation. The breakthrough had been made. Now they were widening it. American artillery answered again, but thinner this time. Ammunition was running low. Guns were repositioning under fire. Some batteries had been overrun entirely in the night, their crews killed at their pieces. Mercer fired when the Germans came within range. The Garand's recoil familiar. Grounding. The rifle cracked. A German fell. Another dropped behind a tree. The line held for minutes, not hours. Then the tanks appeared. Not Panthers this time. Panzer IVs, still deadly. Still unstoppable against infantry with nothing heavier than rifles and grenades. They rolled forward deliberately, guns trained on the trench, machine guns chattering, raking the frozen earth. Men began to pull back without orders. It wasn't cowardice, it was physics. The trench offered no protection from direct fire. Staying meant dying in place. Halverson reappeared beside Mercer, face streaked with soot and ice. "Left flank's gone," he said flatly. "We're folding back again." "Again?" Mercer asked, voice hoarse. Halverson nodded. "Again!" They ran. The second fallback was worse than the first. There was no time to organize, no landmarks to orient by. The forest was a maze of identical trees and drifts, every direction the same. Units intermingled, commands dissolved. Men followed whoever seemed to know where they were going. At one point, Mercer found himself sprinting beside a paratrooper from the 101st, his helmet marked with a faded spade. The man was limping badly, one leg stiff. He grinned through chattering teeth. "Hell of a way to spend New Year's," he shouted. Mercer didn't answer. By mid-morning, the cold became its own weapon. Fingers stopped working. Weapons jammed. Men began to fall behind, not because they were wounded, but because their bodies simply shut down. Hypothermia crept in quietly, stealing judgment first, then strength. Mercer watched one soldier sit down in the snow and refuse to get up. "Just a minute," the man muttered. "Just need a minute." They dragged him to his feet. 10 minutes later, he collapsed again, eyes unfocused. This time, he didn't respond. The Germans kept coming. Every mile gained by the enemy widened the bulge in the Allied line. Roads clogged with retreating units and supply trucks moving the wrong direction. Engineers blew bridges behind them, sometimes with Americans still crossing. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned, their crews joining the infantry on foot. Above it all, the sky remained useless. Low cloud cover grounding Allied aircraft, denying the one advantage the Americans usually relied on to stop armor. Mercer reached a crossroads in the early afternoon where military police were desperately trying to sort traffic. Wounded streamed past. Stragglers. Units without officers. Officers without units. Someone shouted that Bastogne was being surrounded. Someone else said it was already cut off. No one knew what was true. All Mercer knew was that the Germans were still advancing, and every hour they weren't stopped made it harder to stop them at all. As night fell again on New Year's Day, the temperature dropped further. The forest creaked and snapped as trees contracted in the cold. Frost formed inside canteens. Men urinated on their hands to keep fingers alive. Mercer dug another foxhole with numb hands, the shovel ringing against frozen ground just like the night before. He checked his watch. 2,100 hours. The first full day of the new year was almost over. The Germans had not been stopped. And somewhere ahead, deeper in the Ardennes, exhausted American units were about to make their stand, not knowing they were about to become the center of one of the most desperate battles of the entire war. By the second night, the war had lost its edges. Mercer didn't know where his company ended, and another began anymore. Names stopped mattering. Units blended together in the dark. Infantrymen from half a dozen divisions sharing foxholes, passing ammunition without asking who it belonged to. The Ardennes had turned into a funnel, and everything inside it was being pushed west whether it wanted to move or not. The roads were the worst part. What should have been quiet forest lanes became arteries of panic. Trucks nose to tail, headlights blacked out, engines coughing in the cold. Wounded men sat on tailgates wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. Officers stood in the middle of intersections waving pistols, screaming orders no one could hear over the engines. Mercer was pressed into traffic control without being asked. Someone shouted, "You! Stop them from turning left!" And suddenly that was his job. He stood in the road, boots numbing into blocks of wood, directing trucks filled with artillery shells, gasoline, rations, everything the Germans were trying to capture intact. A staff car skidded to a stop inches from him. A major leaned out, face gray. "Where the hell is the line?" he demanded. Mercer stared at him. "What line?" he said. The major didn't answer. He just closed his eyes for a second, then drove on. That was when Mercer understood something terrifying. This wasn't just a retreat. This was a race. The Germans weren't trying to destroy the American army outright. They were trying to outrun it, to punch west, seize fuel dumps, cut roads, and collapse the Allied timetable before anyone could react. And for the first time since Normandy, it was working. Mercer finally collapsed near dawn in a barn already packed with men. There was no room to lie down. They slept sitting up, backs against frozen walls, helmets still on. Someone shared a cigarette, lighting it inside cupped hands. The smoke tasted like comfort. Outside, artillery thundered again. Not close, not yet. Mercer dreamed of warmth and woke up shivering so violently his teeth clicked. His breath came out in white bursts. The man beside him was dead, frozen sometime in the night, eyes still open. They carried him outside and leaned him against a fence with the others. By morning, new orders arrived. Hold, delay, buy time. Mercer was pushed forward again, this time into a patchwork defensive line that barely deserved the name. Engineers blew a bridge as German scouts appeared on the far bank. Rifle fire snapped across the frozen creek. Mortars dropped into the trees, showering them with ice and bark. The Germans were relentless. They pressed everywhere, testing for weakness, forcing Americans to give ground inch by inch. Sometimes Mercer fired until his rifle barrel steamed in the cold. Sometimes he fired once and ran. The rhythm of combat dissolved into fragments. 10 minutes of terror, an hour of waiting, another burst of chaos, and always the cold. The cold never stopped working. Fingers blackened, feet swelled, men lost toes without noticing. Medics amputated frostbitten fingers with knives because there was no time for anything else. Rumors spread faster than orders. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st was trapped. German tanks were running out of fuel. Patton was turning his army north. Mercer didn't know what to believe. He only knew the Germans hadn't broken through yet, and that meant someone, somewhere, was holding. Late on January 2nd, Mercer watched American artillery fire over open sights at German armor, moving through a valley. Shells slammed home. A panzer burned. Infantry scattered. For the first time in days, the Germans pulled back. Not far, but enough. The realization rippled quietly through the exhausted ranks. The Germans could be stopped. They were human. They bled. They ran out of fuel. They froze, too. Mercer leaned against a tree, rifle dangling from numb fingers, and laughed once. A short, broken sound. The war hadn't ended, but it had stalled. And in the Ardennes, stalling was survival. By January 2nd, the Ardennes had stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like a machine. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one. A machine that crushed slowly, methodically, without emotion. It chewed men apart by inches, by hours, by degrees of cold. There were no clean fronts anymore, only pressure zones, places where German force pressed hardest and American resistance thinned until something finally gave. Mercer felt it everywhere. He felt it in his knees, which no longer bent smoothly after days of crouching in frozen holes. He felt it in his hands, which shook uncontrollably when he tried to light a cigarette. He felt it in his thoughts, which arrived slower now, as if moving through syrup. The retreat from the ridge hadn't ended the fighting. It had only stretched it. American units fell back into the forest in staggered waves, leaving small groups behind to delay the German advance. These weren't heroic stands. They were arithmetic. 10 men holding a draw for 15 minutes so 50 more could pull back. a machine gun firing until the barrel froze, then firing anyway until the gunner was dead. Mercer's platoon was folded into another company sometime before dawn. No one bothered explaining it. Names didn't matter anymore. Ranks blurred. Orders arrived, shouted, half-formed, delivered by runners who looked like they hadn't slept since Christmas. The Germans pressed constantly but never recklessly. They attacked at dawn, then again at mid-morning, then just before dark. They probed with patrols at night, feeling for weakness. They shelled crossroads, then waited. They listened. Mercer learned to fear the pauses more than the attacks. Silence meant reorganization. Silence meant someone was studying a map and deciding where to apply pressure next. On January 3rd, Mercer was assigned to a roadblock outside a nameless village whose stone church had lost its roof sometime in the night. The road mattered because everything mattered now. Fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, ambulances trying to get the wounded out before they froze solid. They stacked logs, overturned wagons, wrecked a civilian truck across the road. Someone wired a single anti-tank mine into the mud and marked it with a broken rifle stock. It wasn't much. It didn't need to be. They weren't trying to stop a panzer division. They were trying to slow it. German infantry arrived first. They moved cautiously, rifles low, spreading out through the trees. Mercer fired once, dropped a man, and immediately relocated, dragging his rifle through snow crusted hard enough to cut skin. The return fire came instantly, disciplined, precise. The fight settled into something grinding and intimate. Men firing at shapes they could barely see, grenades detonating in white flashes, the echo of gunfire snapping back off frozen ground, making it impossible to tell where shots were coming from. A German officer shouted an order. Mercer didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Forward, now! The attack came in a rush. Mercer fired until his thumb blistered from reloading clips. A German soldier lunged over the barricade, and Mercer shot him so close the muzzle blast burned his face. Then it was over. Not because the Germans were destroyed, but because they withdrew. Mercer slumped behind the truck wreckage, breathing hard, waiting for the second wave that didn't come. Snow drifted down gently, settling on bodies that no one had time to move. The road was still American. For now. Further west, things were worse. Rumors filtered through exhausted mouths. German armor had broken through at another sector. Fuel dumps captured. American units cut off entirely. Bastogne surrounded. Supplies running dangerously low. No one knew what was true. Everyone knew the situation was bad. Mercer watched officers argue over maps spread on a crate, their fingers tracing roads that were no longer safe. Radios crackled with static and half-answers. Air support was grounded by weather. Artillery ammunition was rationed to a handful of shells per day. The cold continued its own campaign. Men collapsed from exhaustion and simply didn't wake up. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, noses. Medics worked until their hands bled, then worked more. Mercer watched a soldier beg not to have his foot amputated, even as it turned black inside his boot. German prisoners passed through occasionally, young, hollow-eyed, just as frozen and exhausted as the Americans. They didn't look like conquerors. They looked like men pushed past the point of reason by orders that no longer cared whether they lived. On the night of January 4th, Mercer stood guard at an intersection lit only by burning wreckage. Snowflakes drifted through orange firelight. The forest creaked softly. For the first time since New Year's Eve, there were no shells falling. Mercer didn't relax. He knew better now. He knew the war didn't end with silence. It reorganized. Somewhere beyond the trees, German commanders were doing the same math the Americans were, calculating fuel consumption, infantry losses, how far they could push before the machine seized up. The Ardennes had become a contest of endurance, and no one knew yet who would run out first. The change didn't come with a trumpet blast or a cheer. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, like a held breath finally released. Mercer was hunched over a foxhole on the morning of January 6th, when he realized he could see farther than 20 yards. The fog that had wrapped the forest in a suffocating gray shroud for days was thinning, pulling back in uneven sheets. The skeletal trees no longer dissolved into nothingness after a few steps. Their outlines sharpened, their shadows stretched. The sky was still overcast, but it was no longer sealed shut. Men noticed it instinctively. Heads tilted upward. Someone muttered, "Weather's breaking." No one smiled. They had learned not to trust good signs. Then the sound came. At first it was distant, so faint Mercer thought he was imagining it. A low, rolling thunder that didn't match artillery. It grew steadily, layering itself over the forest until it became unmistakable. Aircraft, not one, not a patrol, a mass. The roar swelled until the ground itself seemed to vibrate beneath Mercer's boots. He stepped out of his hole and looked up just as the cloud ceiling fractured. Dozens of dark shapes poured through the gap, wings flashing silver against the pale winter sky. American aircraft, fighters first, P-47 Thunderbolts, big, brutal machines built like sledgehammers. They swept low, engines howling, then peeled off into attack dives that made the air scream. Mercer watched them drop through the clouds and disappear behind a ridgeline where German columns had been advancing since dawn. Seconds later, explosions walked across the horizon. Fuel trucks detonated in towering fireballs. Ammunition carriers vanished in bursts of white smoke and black debris. A German tank tried to turn off the road and bogged down instantly, its tracks spinning uselessly in frozen mud. The Germans scattered. Mercer had seen panic before, but never like this. Infantry abandoned positions they had held stubbornly for days. Vehicles jammed crossroads, trying to reverse under strafing fire. Men who had advanced relentlessly through snow and shell fire now threw themselves into ditches, covering their heads as 50 caliber rounds chewed the earth around them. The Ardennes offensive depended on momentum. Air power had just stolen it. The radio crackled to life everywhere at once. Voices that had been tight and desperate for days now carried urgency edged with something else. Confidence. Orders changed tone. Hold positions became advance cautiously. Delay became exploit. Units that had been hanging on by threadbare discipline suddenly received resupply drops. Canvas bundles slamming into clearings, parachutes snapping in the cold air. Mercer helped drag crates of ammunition out of a clearing while P-47s roared overhead, their pilots rocking wings in acknowledgement. It felt unreal, like a veil had lifted and the war had resumed its proper shape. But the Germans didn't vanish. They adapted. German commanders shifted tactics immediately, pulling armor back into wooded areas, dispersing infantry, hiding vehicles under tree cover. They fought rearguard actions with cold professionalism, using terrain and weather remnants to blunt the American push. The fighting changed character again. Now it was about pursuit. Mercer advanced through villages that looked frozen in time. Abandoned dinners still on tables, candles burned down to stubs. Civilians emerged cautiously, eyes hollow, hands raised in a gesture that had become universal across Europe. German resistance hardened at key points, bridges, crossroads, high ground. Mercer found himself clearing buildings room by room, rifle muzzle leading, heart hammering as loudly as it had on New Year's Eve. He saw things he would never forget. A German medic trying to shield wounded men with his own body. An American lieutenant sitting alone in a church pew, staring at a map as if it might explain what he'd lost. A line of frozen German dead arranged neatly beside the road, boots aligned as if discipline could impose order, even in death. By January 10th, the truth became unavoidable. The German offensive was collapsing. Fuel shortages crippled their armor. Supply lines shattered under air attack. Units that had pushed deep into Allied territory now struggled to retreat without being cut off. American artillery fired without rationing for the first time in weeks, shells marching methodically across retreat routes. Mercer's unit pushed eastward through ground they had lost days earlier. Each mile reclaimed felt heavier than the last. The snow was churned into a gray slurry of mud, blood, and shattered equipment. He recognized landmarks he'd passed while retreating, burned trucks, abandoned foxholes, the remains of roadblocks that had failed. Time folded in on itself. Victory didn't erase fear. It only layered something else on top of it. Exhaustion. By mid-January, men slept wherever they fell. In doorways, against trees, inside shell craters half filled with ice. Orders blurred, faces hollowed. The war wasn't over, but it had turned. Mercer stood one evening watching artillery fire eastward, the flashes lighting the snow in rhythmic pulses. He didn't cheer. He didn't feel relief. He felt older. The Ardennes had taken something he couldn't name yet, but he knew it wouldn't give it back. The snow began to melt before anyone felt ready for it. It didn't disappear all at once. It sagged. It collapsed inward. The Ardennes Forest softened, revealing what winter had hidden, not gently, but all at once. Frozen shapes returned to flesh. White fields became brown scars. The ground released its dead reluctantly, as if offended at being asked to remember. Mercer noticed the smell first. Rot doesn't announce itself dramatically. It creeps in under everything. Sweet, sickly, unmistakable. The men stopped joking entirely once it arrived. No one complained. No one asked how long they would stay. They simply worked. They cleared bodies. Some wore American uniforms stiffened into unnatural shapes. Others wore field gray coats torn by shrapnel and bullets. Many couldn't be identified at all. Dog tags were collected. Letters were burned unread. Helmets were stacked in careful rows. Mercer learned that winter had preserved more than flesh. It had preserved expressions, faces locked in surprise, pain, confusion, determination. A German soldier lay frozen with one hand still clutching a photograph. Two children standing in front of a house that no longer existed. An American lay face down in the mud, fingers still curled around an empty rifle sling. Mercer didn't stop to think about them individually. He couldn't. If he did, he wouldn't have been able to continue. By late January, the bulge was gone. The lines had flattened. The maps no longer showed dangerous protrusions or desperate encirclements. Officers spoke again in measured tones. Logistics resumed something close to normal. Replacement troops arrived. Fresh faces, clean uniforms, eyes that hadn't yet learned how to stop looking. Mercer watched them arrive and felt a strange distance. He was only weeks older than most of them, but the winter had rearranged something inside him. It had compressed time. It had taken the future and folded it backward until everything felt closer than it should. He was reassigned briefly to escort wounded men out of the forest. He watched amputees joke weakly about missing toes. He helped carry a man who kept apologizing for bleeding on everyone. At a field hospital, Mercer saw Sergeant Halverson again. The man who had dragged him from Foxholes and screamed orders into his ear on New Year's Eve was now thin, pale, and missing his right hand. He smiled when he saw Mercer, then looked down as if surprised by the absence. "Guess I won't be yelling much anymore," Halverson said. Mercer didn't know what to say. Neither did Halverson. They sat in silence until a nurse ushered Mercer out. The war pressed forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. By February, the Ardennes was no longer the center of gravity. The fighting shifted east toward the Rhine. Newspapers would later describe the Battle of the Bulge as Germany's last gamble, a desperate roll of the dice that failed. That wasn't how Mercer remembered it. To him, it wasn't a gamble, it was an avalanche. It had come down all at once, without warning, and crushed whatever lay beneath it. The fact that it stopped didn't make it less terrifying. It only made survival feel accidental. On his last night in the forest, Mercer stood alone near a ridgeline and watched the sun sink behind bare trees. The light turned the snow remnants pink, then gray, then black. Somewhere far away, artillery still rumbled, but it felt distant now, like thunder beyond a horizon. He thought of New Year's Eve, of the watch ticking toward midnight, of the flare bursting overhead, of the first shell ripping the night apart. The year had begun with violence so sudden and complete, it felt like the world itself had broken. And yet somehow, the year continued. Mercer understood something then, not clearly, not cleanly, but enough to matter. The Battle of the Bulge hadn't been won by brilliance or daring. It hadn't been won by a single heroic stand or dramatic counterattack. It had been won by endurance, by men who didn't break when the math said they should. Men who froze and shook and bled and stayed anyway. Men who held roads that didn't have names. Men who counted minutes instead of victories. Men who survived long enough for the sky to open. History would talk about Patton's relief of Bastogne, about fuel shortages, about Hitler's final offensive. Mercer would remember the sound of frozen earth ringing under a shovel, The way silence felt heavier than artillery. The exact shade of red a flare painted the snow before everything went wrong. He would remember surviving a night that never seemed like it would end. And years later, long after the war had finished rearranging maps, he would still feel January return in his bones. The Battle of the Bulge ended on paper in January 1945. But for the men who fought it, it never really ended at all. It simply loosened its grip and let them go. The Ardennes Forest returned to being a forest. Snow melted into mud, shell holes filled with water. Broken trees leaned at odd angles, their splintered trunks already graying with age. Birds came back first, cautious and confused, landing on branches that had held machine guns weeks earlier. Then civilians returned, slowly, silently, stepping around places where the earth itself still felt wrong. For the men who fought there, the forest never fully let them go. Private First Class Daniel Mercer left the Ardennes with the rest of his unit, boots worn thin, rifle dulled by cold and use. He didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like someone who had simply not been chosen yet. The war still waited ahead. More towns, more rivers, more nights measured not in hours but in heartbeats. But something had changed. The Battle of the Bulge had stripped the war down to its most basic truth. There were no speeches in the foxholes, no grand ideas, just endurance, just men refusing to move when everything inside them screamed to run. That winter proved something the Germans had not calculated for. They had measured fuel, they had measured armor, they had measured speed and surprise in numbers. They had not measured exhaustion well enough. They had not measured the kind of stubbornness that freezes in place alongside fear and refuses to thaw. The Ardennes did not create heroes. It revealed them, quietly, without ceremony. Years later, the battle would be studied in classrooms and war colleges. Maps would show arrows and bulges and counterattacks. Dates would be memorized. Generals would be praised or criticized. But the truth of it lived somewhere else. It lived in frozen foxholes at 23:57 hours, in watches checked one last time before midnight, in hands too numb to reload quickly, in men who stayed anyway. New Year's Eve is supposed to be about beginnings. In the Ardennes, it became a test of whether anything could continue at all. The war moved on. The calendar turned. Victory came months later, far away from the forest that had nearly swallowed an army whole. But for those who stood there in the dark, listening to the earth ring beneath their shovels, the memory remains sharp. Because in the final hours of 1944, the world did not end. It held, and that was enough.